Welcome to Policy Talks. I am your host, Etimofyong. Our guest is Imraan Saloojee. Imraan Saloojee is the Director at the Research Institute for Innovation and Sustainability, a leading management and innovation consultancy focused on driving long-term sustainability through radical changes in how businesses and society innovate. Imraan has been in the Earth observation business for over 2 decades. I've actually had the opportunity of working with him in drafting the African policy and strategy, and I can see some colleagues here also who are involved in that process. He joins us to share some insights based on his experience in the Earth observation thematic sphere. Imraan Saloojee, welcome to Policy Talks.
Oh, thank you very much, and nice to see some old familiar names on the call as well.
Okay, let's start with your background. Just for us to have a glimpse of your career. Would you like to share about your journey into the field of Earth observation?
Yeah, it's maybe an accidental journey into the field of Earth observations. I have a background in physics, and I worked in different sectors. Worked in at one stage as a teacher. Worked in the mining sector as well as in the rock mechanics department in the mining sector, and then moved from there to science policy arena at the Department of Science and Technology, or Arts, Culture, Science and Technology as it was at that time in South Africa. I think around 2002, when the World Summit on Sustainable Development happened, there was a move globally, internationally, to establish the Group on Earth Observations. And for my sins, I suppose, I got involved with that, and that was the real sort of start in the journey towards Earth observation. So, I suppose, given my background and so I was involved with the setting up of GEO, part of the support to the late Bob Scholes, one of the implementation task team members, and I was assisting with him to set up GEO over the 2005 to 2003 to 2006 period. Wrote the founding documents of GEO as part of a team that included colleagues from the European Commission as well as Japan and then the US as well and South Africa, and then started working in the GEO Secretariat. So that was really the sort of the real sort of day-to-day type of work around Earth observation. Started in 2002, 2003, around that time. And from there, worked at the GEO Secretariat, also as the Director of Earth Observations at the Department of Science and Technology, and then transitioned to the Space Agency after that. In between, been involved in many policy and strategy discussions around space and Earth observations, not least of all together with some of the colleagues on this call, in the development of the African space strategy and African space policy as part of the AU space working that you and Paul, for example, are as well. So that's and now in this for the past year have moved into working in a consultancy in the private sector, but focusing very much on space and space innovation ecosystem. So it's a transition to different components of space, and particularly looking at how the startup sector on the continent can be energized into contributing to the space journey that we undertaking as a continent. And I think that's a very important component of it. complementary component to what is happening in the public sector in space. Together, I think they would be looking at the sort of broader sustainability of space efforts on the continent. So I think.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Imraan, can you increase your voice a little bit?
Okay, I will try to do that, try and speak louder.
Okay, thanks for the briefing. And I think we'll still talk a bit more about the issue of innovation and entrepreneurship, especially within the space sector. But still talking about your work experience, like you've mentioned, you worked with government. That's when you were with the South African National Space Agency. And then you moved to an international organization. You were involved in setting up GEO, that's the Group on Earth Observation. And now you are in the private sector with RIIS. Can you compare and contrast working within these different terrains, working in Africa, moving outside Africa, moving from public sector to international organization, now for private sector? What's it like?
Yeah, I mean, I think the public sector has been for a long time the seat of space activities globally, and it's certainly an element of or a huge element within Africa as well. I mean, I think that it was a really exciting time, both working at NGOs, setting up something new, as well as within DSI, looking at the emergence of the space agency, us consolidating space-related activities in South Africa around that so as well. I mean, I think there's sort of huge differences around that. The strategy or the policy and strategy environment within and having to establish these institutions brings a different type of dynamic into thinking into the space sector. Working at the space agency has been more at the sort of cold face, although I wasn't very involved with the technical stuff, but it's more at the sort of cold face of Earth observations, of our ability to be able to actually deliver applications and information systems and information to end users as well. A different sort of dynamic around that as well. Now working in the private sector, looking at innovation ecosystems and working with private sector organizations, I think it brings a different dynamic to that. It's slightly more challenging, I suppose, as well. But I think all three of them have been quite complementary elements and I see them as quite complementary elements in my career within the space sector as well. All of them quite dynamic, been fortunate enough to be working at the cold face of all of these in each one of these areas. Fantastic networks and people that you've worked with over the years, and gaining the experience and learning from each one of these experiences. I think it's given me a good sense of public sector, space agency, plus the international, and now some private sector work around this as well. So I've got quite a good policy around that as well, or quite a good spread of experiences around that.
Yeah. Let's talk about GEO a bit. Recently, Nigeria launched what we call GEO Nigeria, the second country to do that in Africa, South Africa being the first to have done that. And then we also have AfriGeos. So could you give us an idea of the structure and workings of GEO as an organization?
Okay. GEO is it's an intergovernmental organization. The primary membership of GEO is from member countries. It's got a huge reach across the globe. Back numbers, but it's close to over 150 countries. But I think the unique thing around it that it's not only bringing in intergovernmental process, but also brings in the international system of through the international organizations, the UN organizations and other international organizations, really to look at the coordination of Earth observation activities across the globe, making policy awareness of Earth observation, raising awareness around Earth observations and its role in policy making and how it can be used, how Earth observations can be used to the benefit of society and making those connections around that. So it's this intergovernmental process, but being an intergovernmental process that is across the globe, it has quite a big mandate to be able to maybe focus it a little bit more on continental levels. GEO created these regional geos, which AfriGeo is one, and AfriGeo plays a very important element in stimulating discussions and raising awareness and doing bringing in as a network organization to bring in the different capacities, capabilities, interests across the continent into a forum, so that there's collaboratively be able to develop solutions around those as well. I think that if you scale that down further within at the national level, again, there's a plethora of organizations that are working in, and contributing and developing Earth observations from the public sector, different agencies across government. And there's also a necessity to being able to coordinate and bring collaboration around this as well. So the whole whole structure is around collaboration, raising awareness, making the policy linkages at the national level, and then bringing that into a continental level, and then bringing that into the global level as well. So that's the way I see the distinction and the connections between GEO at the international level, the AfriGeo, and the national geos like the GEO that was just established in Nigeria, and SAGeo in South Africa as well. A big element of this again is not only public sector being a intergovernmental process at all levels. The public sector is the main driver behind GEO, but there's increasingly awareness and understanding and willingness to bring in the private sector into that discussions, because there's contributions that can be made by both that are complementary to one another.
So like you mentioned, there at the national level, there are already structures and organizations that are already involved in GEO, maybe professional organizations or some other forum. So is there any advantage in having like GEO at the national level, like SAGeo or GEO Nigeria? Because it appears as if these new structures are kind of trying to push down the agenda from the global GEO rather than trying to pull up the national agenda. So what's your thought on that?
No, I think there's definitely a value to that, and I don't think it's so much that the agenda that is set at the global level is pushed down to the national level. What I think the GEO provides is an idea around how collaboration can happen. Collaboration at the global level, collaboration and synergy, developing synergy at the continental level as well as the national level. If you take, South Africa, there's many sites, many organizations that are involved in Earth observations. The question is, how do you not duplicate efforts unnecessarily? How do you ensure that, you know, there's a common direction and goal that we're taking at a national level? And the idea of GEO allows for that to happen at the national level. But if you break it up, you know, bring it up into the continental level, there's activities, there's synergies between activities across the continent, between organizations, or catalyzing new type of synergies as well. And without having those discussions at the continental level or at the national level or at the international level, the catalytic type of opportunity that exists doesn't materialize, or even the collaboration or the coordination opportunity doesn't materialize as well. I don't think there's a global agenda that is you know, pushed down to others. I think, you know, it's very much a bottom up. The way GEO works is very much bottom up, and contributions by each one of the entities that are part of GEO, members of that are on international organizations that are part of GEO, and collaboratively. It's a question of, you know, the whole is what you get. The whole is more than the sum of the parts. So by bringing together, synergistically bringing together efforts, that you're going to get a better outcomes and impacts on that.
What's your take about the proliferation of EU programs in Africa? And of course, most of these EU programs are sponsored from external bodies. So, for example, you have the GMES and Africa, which is primarily funded by the EU, Digital Earth Africa, which came through Australia and maybe some other countries. And of course, even before that, you had the Severe program from the US. So we have all these different programs, different funding, and of course, different mandates, so to say. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think that's. I think if you look, well, the first thing is that we need to be building strong capabilities within the continent to be able to address the challenges that we have. But in doing so, it's not an exclusive sort of activity that, you know, only would have African solutions that are coming, that are, you know, we're building this up from ground, from, in some cases, very, very deep level capabilities, in other cases some nascent type of capabilities as well. I think these programs are important because if they are important, they can be real good contributors, and in many cases are good contributors to the development of capability on the continent, when they are synergized with what is happening on the continent as well. So my own view is that they're important, and collaborations that they bring are important. But we need to have a more sort of holistic view of how these capabilities are rolled out on the continent as well, and how they can genuinely develop the type of capabilities that we require on the continent. And that is largely dependent on us and how we are able to use these opportunities. I think in many cases, you know, some of the GMES programs have brought, GMES in Africa programs have brought, and have catalyzed deep level capabilities in programs within the different regions that these are. The same thing with Severe and other efforts as well. Our capabilities are not going to be developed on our own. It must primarily be driven from our own challenges and our own needs, etc. But there can be synergies with all of these as well. So I think that they're good programs. We need to be able to, as Africans, be able to make sure that those synergies and the impacts that we want we are able to influence the way these programs are rolled out in that way.
So if you want to do an evaluation, looking back, say, about 20 years before now, will you say, are we building the required indigenous capabilities? If this funding, if these programs stop, for example, the GMES and Africa, the funding should stop, I think, 2025, at least for this phase, and the other ones. Can African countries or Africa as a continent carry on with maybe an Earth observation program which is beneficial to its people? Do we have such capabilities built now?
I think we have the capabilities, and we must build the capabilities through the implementation of these programs as well. But I think there was a very important element in the African space strategy that was emphasized quite often, and that is, the funding and governance of these programs ultimately needs to be driven by African countries themselves. So I think we probably have a fair amount to do to ensure that from an African perspective that these are sustainable in the long term as well. The programs bring in capabilities. We need to be able to complement that with African capabilities to ensure that it's more sustainable over the longer term as well. And this means that being, deeply involved in the design of the programs, ensuring that African institutions are deeply embedded in the implementation of what that is, in the governance or frameworks around this, and having that sort of longer term sustainability question, not at the end of these programs, but right at the beginning of the programs, to think, to chart a roadmap, to chart the full way forward into how we would make these programs sustainable. I think there's no doubt that these programs bring a lot of value. How we capture the value and how we capture that value going forward is something that we need to deeply think about as well.
Let's talk a bit more about the African space policy and strategy, or the African Outer Space Program as a whole. Like you mentioned earlier, you were strongly involved in the development of the document, and you in particular worked very closely with VAL, even outside the normal activities of the space working group. Let's start for a start. Could you give us a brief of how the documents were developed, especially the activities what you and VAL did, even outside the main activities of the space working group?
Yeah, I think with all of these processes, you have people who sit down and write and collect information and bring together different ideas around it and put it into a coherent format, coherent documents around this as well. So I think a lot of the work that Val in particular, and I support of him as well, did was to take ideas from a broad community of space actors on the continent, and I think that was the real strength of the African space strategy and policy. That it wasn't a document that was written by a few people and brought out. There were huge consultations, and I remember us going to many countries across and having many discussions around that, and bringing those consultations, the ideas that were formed, crystallized, having consulted. So it was a real co-creation type of document around with the African community. Of course, this African Space Working Group was a huge representative of that wider community as well, in the way it was constructed and brought together. So those became also a primary site of ideas on how the strategy and policy and the shape, the shape of directing the shape and strategy of policy as well. I mean, Val and I worked, in the background around this, pulling together all of these. Of course, having our own experiences also shape that policy and things of that sort. But I think the biggest strength of that was the engagement process around this, the number of voices that you had that were coming into the development of African space policy and strategy. And I think that is really the strength around it, and what came out of and what was finally the strategy, and how that got validated again through discussions and workshops. I recall us having quite a very big workshop in Brazil around this, where various stakeholders and actors in the different fields were brought together to validate and to be able to provide new thoughts and inputs and to identify gaps and blind spots within the strategy and things of that sort. And this is why I think in the end the document is a good one. The documents were good ones, and more importantly had wide acceptance as well, because there was this bottom-up process to develop the strategy and policy.
And in the document, there are several projected outcomes, 1 year, 5 year, 10 years, and then there were also these key performance indicators that were there. And the documents were even adopted as far back as 2016. This is 2023. Do you think we are in line in terms of meeting the projected outcomes and the indicators and other targets and goals that were stated there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's good. I think in some areas, yes, we are in line. I think although quite a few years down the line, African Space Agency, is now established and it's beginning to take shape. But establishing new organizations is always a complicated, long process as well. So I think that there are programs that have somewhat come out of and supporting the strategy. Digital Earth Africa, I think, is maybe not directly a program that was identified with that. The same with GMES in Africa. But I think the biggest strength of that was one, the programs that were going to be implemented, and we might not have gone as far down the line as we want to along that. But the other important one is that it provided the document that provided the catalysis for other programs to be established as well. And I think this is something that we mustn't forget, that if we were expecting everything to happen through the African Space Agency or through one organization or the other, I think that would have been maybe an unrealistic expectation of ourselves at that time. But the catalytic impact of the strategy and the policy, having a common vision, a common direction to go, and how this has spawned activities in the rest of the continent, I think is important. I mean, today we're sitting with, I think, Space in Africa said 24 different space agencies across the continent. That is the catalytic impact of these policies and strategies that were developed at the AU. So I think that's and there's activity happening all over the show, and I think that this is really the big strength as well.
You just mentioned, just like you mentioned, that these other programs, Digital Earth Africa, GMES and Africa, they were all initiated and are even being implemented outside the African Space Policy and Strategy, and even the document. So would you say that, in your assessment, would you say that these programs have brought needed value to Africa, and how has that value really impacted on Africa when, I mean, going down to the grassroots right now?
Mm-hmm. No, I certainly believe that these programs have brought needed value. I mean, Digital Earth Africa, for example, providing analysis-ready data, quick, easy access to Sentinel data, not having to, have want people to have to go through the normal remote sensing processes and all of those type of things, has been a spur for innovation on the continent. Small startups are now able to access data in analysis-ready format and develop applications of that. And this is, where the real value of the data is. So, same thing with GMAS in Africa. I think that it's pulled together consortia in different regions, addressing different challenges, bringing type of things. So undoubtedly, these programs for me have brought in a lot of value. And it goes back to maybe an earlier point that I made, that I don't think we should be expecting everything that is happening in space to happen through the African Space Agency or through the African Union or even through space agencies at national level. There's going to be different sites, and the big thing is how do we coordinate this? How do we make sure that there's no unnecessarily duplicative efforts, that we're not establishing competing infrastructure when resources are little, that we can use and reuse type of infrastructure, etc., type of thing as well. So undoubtedly, the question that these have for me provided huge value. We mustn't, and I don't think we need to expect everything to come through that, as long as there's a broad thrust and understanding of the space strategy and where Africa is contributing to that mission and vision of the strategy and policy as well, and which I believe these programs that are coming in are doing as well.
I know these programs are kind of focused more on Earth observation, but the policy and strategy actually has other sectors, or let's say 4 sectors. So Earth observation, satellite communication, navigation and positioning, and astronomy. And of course, there are other things, even though they are not covered directly, like satellite development, space operations. So how can we also develop these other sectors, and not just, even though for many people, Earth observations appears to be a low-hanging fruit, but like you have physics background, a core component of physics is astronomy. So how do we develop these other sectors so that it's not Earth observation all the time, so to say?
Yeah. I think that there is activity on the continent that is in these other sectors as well, through initiative that we working with the Africa Earth Observation Challenge, and we came across the Joint Program Office for Satellite and Navigation on the continent, linked to the African Union Commission as well, and they looking at satellite and navigation and the promotion and the development of applications and the development and the use of satellite and navigation. Well, I mean, we know about the space weather program that is happening across the continent, located at SANSA, but I think has collaborations across the continent as well. The same thing goes with with telecommunications. There's ongoing discussions around telecommunications satellites that have been sent up by individual countries as well, and that type of things. So there's probably a lot more in these activities that are happening on the continent than maybe we necessarily know of or have the sort of exposure, the public exposure that Earth observations have. I think one of the things is that we need to be able to understand where all of this is. Some of them are a little bit more nascent and a little bit, less, less mature, so to speak, than the Earth observations type of thing. But I think that there's a lot of these activities that are happening. I think what needs to happen is that we need to scale these sort of activities and bring more participants into them, into the discussions as well. And of course, from Space Agency side, from the African Union Commission side, also have a focus on these sort of activities. The important question for me is, how do these activities link to benefit for society out of this as well? And there's clear benefits for society around this, from space weather, astronomy, the square kilometer array telescopes, infrastructure, the fiber infrastructure that is going to be coming with this, the development of human capital that is coming out of these programs. I think there's huge benefit around this that finds its way into other parts of the economy as well. So I think activities are happening, maybe not at the scale of Earth observation, or don't have the visibility of Earth observations, which has maybe an advantage of having a very direct link to impact and people's lives. But I think the activities in this, of course, there's always opportunities and necessity to scale these across the continent and draw in more voices and activities around these areas.
Yeah, I agree with you. A couple of activities in other sectors, but even those activities at the continental level also, they are funded by external agents. So navigation and positioning, you have the EGNOS in Africa program, which is also funded by the EU. And then in satellite communication, there's the plan to this RIIS-2 program, which is also funded by the EU. So most of the continental programs appear to still, the funding still comes from outside. But are there any formal mechanisms, feedback mechanisms to measure the impact of these programs, but space technology in general, all these initiatives? How do we measure the impact on the African society? Are there measures in place, systems in place?
Perhaps that's a weakness around it that we need to be able to. I think I think it comes back to an earlier point that I made around us having to ensure that where we want these programs to go in the long term is designed right at the beginning of this, and that we are able to identify what it is that we want to get out of these programs as well. I think that I think maybe the sort of truth to this is that there's very little additional funding to be able to run some of these programs on the continent itself. And I think the necessity for this is all these programs is there. The trick for me is, how do we use these opportunities, and I see them as opportunities that are coming in, and how do we use these opportunities to be able to build as a springboard, building our own capability and being able to ensure that these programs are able to address the types of concerns, the types of impacts that we want as well. And I think having programs that are funded from outside is not a bad thing. What we need to do is to make sure that we are able to build on what is coming to make sure that these are essentially, become African-led programs, African-funded programs as well. It provides an impetus for us to be able to do that as
well. Earlier on, you mentioned, maybe just in passing, the Africa Health Observation Challenge, which your organization has been facilitating. Could you shed some more light on it?
Yeah, certainly. The Africa Earth Observation Challenge is an attempt to start stimulating startups within the startups on the continent to start looking at Earth observations, but specifically, but space more generally, as an opportunity for entrepreneurship on the continent itself. So it's a startup origination program that is run across Africa, a number of countries involved. This year we've got Angola participating, Tunisia with Tunsa participating in that as well, Egypt, NARS as well. And the idea is to run an open innovation challenge with partners, both from private sector, international, national, continental partners, run an open innovation challenge that is asking entrepreneurs out there to develop good ideas on how they could address challenges in various thematic areas, whether in agriculture, climate change, or navigation and positioning, water resource management, SDGs, etc., type of thing, and what new applications that can be developed that would be also be able to sustain businesses around that as well. And the challenge is really focused on that, identifying those startups, putting them through an open innovation challenge where they are able to pitch their ideas to a panel of judges, winners from that selected. Those winners are able to then go through an incubation process and a mentorship progress through organizations like GenSpace. They have access to data and information through organizations like Planet and Maxa and Esri as well. Go through incubation, the Cyber Innovation Summit, Tech Drive Accelerator, and these together, have training on and mentorship on having to deal with IP and manage IP within the organization. So maturing these startups to a point where they can be investable organizations, doing the matchmaking with potential investors through showcasing days, etc., and matching investors with those organizations. So it's based on the concept that, or on thinking that public sector on the continent is doing a lot to be able to stimulate space and space-related activities, providing infrastructure, doing research and development, bringing knowledge into that. But how do the public sector itself is not going to be big enough and have enough investment in it to be able to drive a space economy on the continent. And you're going to have a private sector that is going to be working in tandem with the private sector. How do the technologies and the applications that come up get scaled to the point where they can address that last mile, taking these applications at scale and addressing farmers or small-scale farmers across the continent. And it's not going to be possible for the public sector to do that, but many private sector players are able to do that. And it's focused on, identifying those startups and providing them with some sort of mentorship and incubation process as a way to kickstart that engagement of entrepreneurship and building a culture of entrepreneurship within the space sector as well across the continent.
So how long have you been running the program, and what has been the feedback in terms of the impact of the program so far?
So the program has been running since 2016. It started off as a very small or country level program here in South Africa, SANSA, others involved in it. And over the last 6 or 7 years, it's gone through a continental program where we've had 3 partners right at the beginning, to close to 20 partners and it's really done as the program is done as a partnership through all of them, to 20 partners across the continent. Last year, in the last 2 or 3 instances, it was run as a continental program. Last year it was, Rwanda, Kenya, South Africa, Kenyan Space Agency, Rwandan Space Agency, South African National Space Agency that were involved in it, together with Planet and AXA and ESRI, and quite a number of partners. Some of them are sort of Gen Space from Sidos, which is an IP law firm. This year we've broadened it further. We've gone from receiving 20 submissions in the early years to close to 80 submissions last year across the continent as well. Some of the startups that have come through have managed to make connections with investors. Some of them, changed their business models, which started using more Earth observation data and providing services and things of that sort as well. So it's this year we're looking at partners in North Africa, Tunsa from Tunisia, NARS, as I've indicated, GGPEN in Angola as well, KSA, SANSA again as well involved. And it's an ever-growing and expanding type of competition, where we are really looking at those SMMEs that have got great ideas, have gone through some degree of technology maturity or understanding the technology and bringing it to that sort of business acceptance.
Any sustainability measures in place so that it does not just end maybe with RIIS, or after a few years we don't get to hear about it again?
So I think right from the outset, the whole concept of the Earth Observation Challenge was really based on this partnership approach, which also ensures that there's sort of sustainability around this as well. Of course, finding the funding to do this every year is always a challenge, but we somehow manage around that, with what the in-kind contributions that each of these partners bring. I mean, sustainability is always a question mark on this as well. But I think that the more sort of partners, the more buy-in that we have from continental partners, the more sustainable this becomes. And I think the other issue around sustainability is that, as a continental competition, you need national organizations coming to as part of the partnership to be able to bring in that focus on the national agenda. And having SING in Gabon, which is an incubator looking at identifying startups in Gabon and Francophone Africa, because of their networks there. Tunsa, which is working in Tunisia, but also has linkages into the Maghreb. The Kenyan Space Agency, SANSA involved as well. I think we all contributes to that social sustainability of the competition itself and the program itself. And so hopefully this will, we've had a discussion with all the partners last year when we had the pitching event in Nairobi during the Kenya Innovation Week. It was kindly hosted by the Kenyan Space Agency, and there was a commitment by the partners to look at this as a 3-year sort of program at the edition. So this, the sustainability and the commitment from the partners is really goes hand in hand.
Do you see any role for the African Space Agency in this initiative?
Of course, I think. I think the African Space Agency, space agencies at national level as well, really have a role in this. I think all space agencies, I haven't come across one across the continent that doesn't have the strategic documents or in their policies the linkage with private sector. This gives a good way to catalyze young people, particularly coming into and finding opportunities within this in space sector as well, and gives a sort of a very sort of practical, implementable program to be able to generate that interest and build this culture of entrepreneurship and innovation in those. So having the African Space Agency and National Space Agency is really important to bring in those sort of national level focal points as well, all continents.
So,
Digital Earth Africa is also part of this. So, one of the big barriers to stimulation of all of this is access to data, which the data partners are bringing to. There's also the question of building entrepreneurial capabilities within those startups as well, which the other partners. So it's a end-to-end type of program.
So like you said, this is competitions in general, including this. I know at the national level, there are other competitions, like in Nigeria, there's a hackathon that is going on right now. In Egypt, there is a CubeSat competition going on. So all these are towards developing capability, establishing new companies, and developing industry. Well, what other ideas could you proffer towards developing the African space industry?
So I didn't get the question.
Yes, I was saying that. I mean, like you have this Earth Observation Challenge, which is going on now. At other levels, so at national levels, there are other competitions also going on. In Nigeria, there's a hackathon going on. In Egypt, there's a CubeSat competition. And I think there's also a competition going on in Kenya, if I'm not mistaken, unless it's ended. And all these are towards developing capability, establishing new companies, fostering the industry. But aside from these kind of initiatives, what other ideas are needed to boost African space industry?
I think the basis of the Africa Earth Observations Challenge is a thinking that says that you need to have an ecosystem approach to developing entrepreneurship and the startup community and the private sector. And this means that it's having to take not only look at the sort of technical capabilities and the access to data type of elements as well, but also building capabilities in entrepreneurship, but also looking at access to finance. Where would these companies go for to be able to finance what they're doing? How do you bring them to a level of investable companies so that venture capital, other financing mechanisms are able to look at this and find value in that and build the value of these companies. It also looks at having to think about from a government level the policies and policies and regulations around this as well. What are the sort of policies around small business development or on startup development? What are the programs that can assist these, and most countries have these sort of programs in place as well. How do you build a culture of entrepreneurship, innovation within those countries? What is the mechanisms for access to markets to make these companies sustainable, type of thing. So there's a whole thinking around innovation ecosystems that I think needs to permeate the discussions around private sector development in the space sector. And we are doing, as RIIS, we're doing work around this, on building innovation and this is where our strength lies, is building innovation ecosystems around in different sectors, and the space sector is one of them as well. And we're doing some good work with countries and entities on the continent around this. So I think, short answer to your question is, to be able to really make the impact around this, we need to think about this as an innovation ecosystem approach. What are all the factors that are going to ensure that we have SMMEs and sustainable and successful SMMEs around that? And it's not just a question of here's the technology, here's the interest, and because it takes many more things are needed to make a successful startup, or a startup to become successful.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I think we plan to have a further discussion on the concept around innovation ecosystem on 20th of June. But let me just ask you one last question. I think I have time for just one more question. And that has to do with maybe your advice for young people. So you've had an excellent career in the space sector. So for students and young professionals who are interested in pursuing a career in space generally, what would you advise them?
I think all I can say is seize the opportunities. Let your imaginations run wild. We very much I would think at the bottom of a huge wave in the space industry, not only on the continent because of all the the developments that have happened over the last 5 to 10 years, and there's incredible amount of movement in the space sector on the continent itself in the last 5 years, but also globally. How the space sector is developing and changing. This creates a huge amount of opportunities. So I think that just my best advice is, if you consider the space sector as a career path, it doesn't necessarily have to be within a space agency or within a research organization, but also the private sector. There's opportunities there, and let your imagination, let your innovation kick in around this to be able to do that. So I think there's huge opportunities, and just seize the day around that.
Thank you very much. We'll have to stop at this point. Imraan, really appreciate your time. Thanks for the insights and the ideas you've shared. And thanks everyone for joining us. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have another discussion on innovation ecosystem to at least dive a bit more into this concept and how we can use it to boost space in Africa. So I look forward to seeing us at that event also. Thanks once again, Imraan, and thanks everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Tim. Bye, everyone.